This is Joe Wheaton from Utah State University, and following on from Scott Cheverdian's talk on doing design at the complex scale, we're going to focus in on the structure scale now. And the reason for doing this is not because it's the scale that we advocate working at, but it's to teach you as a designer how the pieces fit together. A lot of what we're going to talk about here is what is going to turn into an implicit thought process for you that you could do this level of detail and documentation, but we're strongly advising against it. The reason we're advising against it is because it sets the focus on the structures instead of setting the focus on improving riverscape health. And that's why we think the complex scale makes more sense. However, for you to understand what you're doing, focusing at the structure scale is going to be useful. Okay. And there may be specific projects that you do where you decide to document at the structure scale because you have the budget to learn and to do that. Just don't make it a habit. Okay. Remember Carol? If you don't, that means that you need to go back and watch the what is it? We're in module 4, so part C from the first part of this design module. And Carol and Pops, her dad, this was the ranch that we were working at. This is the same thing that we were looking at Coburn Creek in the planning module 3. These were the exercises you did. And so just to remind you what we're looking at, we've zoomed in to just Coburn Creek. We've made up a artificial, if you will, little property line. Okay. And what we've found here from this morning was that half of this was inactive floodplain and the other half was a mix of active floodplain and active channel. So not terrible in terms of current condition, but certainly could be better. And Carol said, well, this is what this intersection of the pink, the recovery potential, and the inactive, that's the additional sort of 22 acres, right? That she said would be fine if the riverscape had access to. There's still this chunk here that's going to be out of play and remain inactive. What we're going to do in zooming down from this riverscape view, zooming down to just illustrate how to design at the structure scale, is we're going to focus on some structures and a complex that would address this little reach right here. Okay, so that's me zooming in. This imagery, by the way, is just off of what Google Maps. It's the same stuff that we were using in the previous exercises, but just zoomed in. You can actually see quite a bit of detail. You can see individual trees that have fallen in and are getting recruited. You can see individual places where it looks like we're at sort of a bank full flow here, and things are spilling out a bit. And what you're dealing with, the yellow line is that valley bottom margin. The other valley bottom margin's off the page. The recovery potential is right along here in pink. And the width of this recovery potential zone varies between about 140 feet and 330 feet. And so there's definitely some opportunities in here. So following on Scott's excellent sort of summary of what the design process is, an elaboration of that, have at it. Do your complex design, right? Put your blue PALs and your red BDAs as the symbols and put your zone of influence for the whole complex in here. What would that look like? How would you do that? Okay. So where do you start, right? Okay, what did Scott say? Oh yeah, Scott said, yeah, you need that zone of influence, you need the valley bottom, you need narrative, you need structure locations. Okay, so boom, 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 these are the things, right? And it's a lot, right? It's a lot to think about. Where you actually start is back where we drew your attention to out of planning this morning with recovery potential. So the recovery potential is where we're going to look. Okay, so and we're going to specifically look at the recovery potential up in that little zone. Okay, so what could that zone be? Well, we said that Carol's whole thing could potentially become, stage 0, right? Or stage 8. So the difference being anastomosing, they're both anastomosing stages, but one, stage 8, is a part of the valley bottom. Stage 0 is the whole thing. So if we look at the whole thing, this would be stage 8 where we're working. This would be stage 8, stage 8. Boom, pops out, could be the whole thing. So the stage 0 opportunity is all down at the bottom. That should also give you some confidence that if you are doing the design, and you can do this, indeed people taking this for credit, that's going to be the homework assignment, is to come up with a design for this whole area. And if you're talking about coming onto a delta coming onto a fan and actually really splitting flow out and across that fan, what a great way to sort of diffuse energy as it enters back into Fall Creek. So our target in here is a portion of the valley bottom, so it's stage 8. That's what you're shooting for. So, all right, so first step, okay, so what's my primary complex objective for this design? Well, right, these are the sort of things, the form you're going to have to fill out. So Scott told us that we could have increased in-stream complexity as a common complex objective. Incision recovery, widen and degrade the channels, another common one. Beaver translocation is another common one. Increased channel floodplain connectivity, that's also another common one. But that's not an exhaustive list, but these are some of the more typical low-tech complex design objectives. So when we're in here, it may be easier for you to think like, well, what's my outer limit or long-term target? That's what the recovery potential provides. So it's not valley bottom wide, but it is anastomosing, and it's within this recovery potential. That's where you're shooting for. And in this design, it doesn't necessarily have to be that your design is to get you to stage 8 immediately, or to get you all the way to stage 8 across that entire recovery potential. The question is really how far towards that target do you think it's realistic to push it in this first phase, okay? So because this is that design for just the first phase of implementation, let's just remind ourselves, coming out of planning, we have recovery potential, right? How much will this phase, this current treatment that I'm going to be on, close the gap between the condition and the recovery potential? That's the question. And you're going to have to grapple with how many treatments and how long will it take to become self-sustaining. But this first thing is, how much of that gap is it realistic to close? And so, whoops, sorry. I don't know why that's doing that, but it's okay. So what's my primary complex objective for this design? Well, it's in part to increase in-stream complexity. This isn't an incised reach, so it's not that. And, there's already beaver here. We don't need to do any beaver translocation. So it's really to increase the channel floodplain connectivity, or in this particular example, another way of also articulating that is to make it anastomosing, right? So one of those two is what you're going to call. So now you're ready to design some structures. And now you're kind of transitioning this question of where could I target to make my way riverscape left, right? So this thing has been artificially pushed off to riverscape right. It's finding its way on its own, kicking out, little assist from conifers being blown down off the hill slopes and into here, little wood recruitment. And so, but you want to continue that. I mean, look at this. It's already kind of got some what we'll call wandering tendencies tending towards anastomosing anyway. And so you want to push it along. But when we say my way, we mean i.e. active channels that we could bring right. So to anastomose, that's that goal, you're going to need some flow splitting, right? So think about that. Go back to your pocket guide. Starting on, what is it? Starting on page 23 and extending all the way through to page 48, there's just a bunch of recipes, a whole bunch of different structure types. How do they work? What are they intended to do? Which ones can cause flow splitting? You might want to think about shaking up some of the stretches that you want to shunt flows and bank blast, okay? And once you're on the floodplain, you might be able to back up water further, or spread it out, or split it further. So what we do is we go into our riverscape, and remember, design, as Scott described it, we tend to do these designs in the field. So we're just virtually facilitating this and doing it off of aerial photography, and it's not as satisfying or as good as doing it in the field, but you do have the luxury of being able to have that bigger picture perspective on it. You can do it iteratively too. We tend not to, but you can, especially for learning, where you can do a desktop design and then go out and do your actual design on the ground. We find it works just as well if you've done your desktop planning to then go out and just do your design on the fly and be reading your riverscape. But in the beginning, you might take more steps just so that you can learn. So the question now, what opportunities can be accentuated when I read these riverscapes locally, and what weaknesses can be broken up or improved? And so kind of neat. There's already places where flow's splitting out at high flows. There's already places where it's spitting out at this bank flow. Here. There's some straight shots. There's some opportunities to split. There's already some eroding banks in various places. There's almost a neck cutoff taking place here that would create a pretty cool oxbow back there. Oxbows often get banned up by beaver, by the way. So, yeah. So think about those pieces, those things that you're going to need to do. So get your design ducks in a row. First part, you got your area that you're going to design for. So you got your zone, or your, sorry, not complex zone of influence, but your recovery potential area. And you have a palette of different brushes you could use, different structure types. Let's decide the symbols for those. You could just use dots, but I would suggest for this learning exercise at the structure scale, we do crests, which represent the tops of those structures. And let's use blue for PALs and red for BDAs, okay? And then what else do we have here? What are you trying to achieve? This is the most important thing. Well, I'm trying to get from one laterally active channel towards anastomosing. That's what you're trying to achieve, okay? So let's pick off an easy one to start. So if you printed out the exercise, this is going to be page 2. And what I want you to do is to think about how you can place those PALs and BDAs in here. I want you to think about, are there any places that you could blast a bank, right? That you could literally push towards the recovery potential that channel. So you're going to draw a crest that represents the PALs. You could do one or more PALs to do that. And then you're going to draw a zone of influence. So you got a structure that might help with that. Appendix D, this is the bank blaster version of a bank attached PALs, okay? So just position it where you want it and draw a crest. Once you've done that, so let's say this is the plan form map I've drawn. I'm going to just do this with you for a second here. So let's just say that I've drawn my crest. That would be my crest right there. And if you want to, let's change this. I'll make it purple for my zone of influence, I guess. And so what would my zone of influence look like? Well, I've actually done this before, but it looks something like this, where I've got a hydraulic zone of influence, a little backwater upstream, and I've got my, how do I turn this pin off? And I've got the area that I'm going to erode into the bank. So, you did what? You eroded a bank? Yes. So when you have a PAL like this, so one of the things to recognize with these bank blasters is when you build it, if you don't get any additional wood accumulation on it, it's going to do its work in the first, few floods or whatever, um, and it's going to shift this thing to the right. If we come back to our, oops, if we come back here, right? So that's why this zone of influence is drawn, where it's just sort of shifting that flow width, basically a channel width over. Now, if more wood accumulates on the end of this thing, or if you come back and do another treatment, you can keep kicking it, that direction. But it's going to take either a process of natural wood accumulation or artificial, with subsequent treatments, little top ups on those structures. So you could think about what you're doing in this step, in this design step, is just putting in these guys and coming up with that zone of influence. So I'm going to shut up and take you back to here. Why don't you pause this? I'll leave it for 5 seconds and then come back when you're done and I'll explain the way I designed it. Okay, so coming back, here's what I did. I noticed that this bank right here is already moving this way. It's outside bend, and I have momentum piling up there. So I put in a structure that really aggressively created a constriction jet against that to shift that. Okay, shunt flow over there. Put a little backup structure in down there, and another backup in there. We often do these things kind of in series, right? Especially on a little bit bigger system to see if we can't have a little built-in redundancy. So what's the zone of influence for this? Well, kind of something like what we drew in the other cartoon. Now, you may have put your structures somewhere else. Let's say you put them here to blast this bank. Well, that's fine. That could get in and recruit some wood, but that's not necessarily the same as pushing closer to your zone of influence where it's already doing it, really accentuating that. So that's why I placed this one here in this example. So we've taken care of that eroding bank. We got this area up here where it's already splitting. So I don't know. Let's maybe do a BDA. So next, what you could do is draw a primary and a secondary BDA, or you can do a few more if you want to. Leave whatever structure you got, and try and build a BDA. So I guess that will be red for the crest, and then for whatever's backwater ponding, you'll make dark blue, and then in your areas that you're overflowing. The free flowing, unless that's explicitly part of your design, you don't necessarily have to show. So with your zone of influence, draw them as those regions. I'll shut up for 5 seconds and let you take as long as you need on pause to do your design. Okay, assuming you've gotten there. Again, many different correct answers. It's the thought process that's important here. This is what I came up with. I decided it's a big enough system. I'm going to put some BDAs in that have posts. And so I probably actually would build it as one of these post lists and then put the posts in at the end. But there's a difference between a primary and a secondary dam. It's really just one of size. The primary dams are a little bit taller. And so in this case right here, I would consider this one probably a secondary dam. The primary dams are a little taller so that they can have deeper water, and they're typically servicing a lodge for beaver. The secondary dams would tend to at least just spill out on, whoops, I'm not doing a good job of drawing that straight, but imagine it perfectly straight. They're going to spill out onto the floodplain. Okay, and actually this one is showing a crest that is spilled out a little bit onto that floodplain. And, so this is going to be built up to a little bit higher, right, crest, and therefore it's going to subsequently backwater. I'm not drawing that very well, but you get the idea, okay? And so This is what you're going to do. And I put in mine right there. I was recognizing that, hey, it's kind of a cool spot there, where I have the opportunity to backwater up into this area that's flooding at high flow. Right now, that's just exposed sediment. And, back it up a little ways here. And so, but to get it just spreading out onto that floodplain, that's a pretty big structure. So I started like, okay, I need a secondary, and I thought about putting one right here, but then I was like, maybe I could just plug this whole thing. That'll provide the backwater into the base of this that that backs it up so that I don't have too big of a head drop between the two. Too big of an elevation difference. And so the way you can think about that is if I have a big drop, so if we go back to this, if this was my crest of that upstream one that I built, and I'm worried about this elevation drop right there, I can come downstream and I can build a dam that backwaters up to here such that it gets rid of that part. Whoops, it erases the whole thing, but it gets rid of a bunch of that head. So that's kind of a handy little thing to be able to do. Okay, so that's the two I built, and this one I realized, hey, this is a lot of crest length, but it's already spilling out here. This is already like kind of floodplain already. So all I've got to do is build a fairly short dam across this, and even shorter when it gets onto the floodplain. And then I might be able to shunt flow and spread flow out and split flow out all across a much broader surface. Again, since this is the main channel, that ends up being, some height. And so a little secondary to backwater up against that. And then when I started drawing, I thought, oh, actually, maybe I'm building this so big it's backwatering up here and spilling out there. And so what did we do? I built another little crest, and we see beaver do this too, where you're just kind of chasing that contour, chasing the elevation that you commit to somewhere. So that's ponded area behind that. It's ponded area behind that one, little ponded area there. And then I'm predicting that this is going to spread water out over this floodplain surface as overflow much more extensively than that it's doing right here. And then same thing there. So these would be my zones of influence, my predictions. And so this exercise of drawing individual structures by drawing the crest, and then thinking about the zone of influence for each structure, and even breaking it like we did here into ponded overflow. Here I could have broke this zone of influence into the area that I would call, eroded bank, right? And then I could have had an area downstream that was, maybe I underdrew that, was, a bar developing, etc. So you can play those sorts of games. Now, how do I get to something that is the zone of influence collectively for all of these things? Well, it's just a union of all this stuff, right? So I can just kind of come around and include the zones of influence, and I'm not sure that, it needs to be that accurate, but do something along those lines, okay? And so that purple would be, my zone of influence if my complex just consisted of these 1, 2, 3, 4 BDAs. It's 1 or 2 primary, and these 3 PALs. So that's not a complete complex design per se, but if that's what that was, that would be my zone of influence. And so then your question really needs to be at that stage, like, great. So I'm getting this area, right, that you're picking up as active, these floodplain surfaces. You're making them not only active, but you're making them, probably inundated for longer, if not year round. And especially some of these surfaces here. So we're changing, in this case, we're not actually expanding the footprint of total active area, but we're taking the active area that there is and we're making it more functional, and that's where that inundation metric would play out. Okay, so I'm going to turn that off. Oh, I got one more. Okay. Now, Scott had mentioned structure types are driven by condition and objectives. And so we were focused on floodplain connectivity. We didn't, as an exercise, build any channel spanning PALs. Instead, we did it with BDAs. But he's saying, right, for floodplain connectivity, you're probably going to use some more channel spanning PALs, and then a mix of things, right? In-stream complexity, which is a secondary objective, more of a mix of structures. And so you can think about that. This is just sort of made up and hypothetical, but it's a good sort of go by. Our temptation, I think, given that BDAs are the gateway drug in, is to use BDAs everywhere. And when you see results like this, how can you not? I mean, this is such a wonderful example of I've got this big ponded area. It goes off the screen, comes all the way through, right? But now I've got these overflows surfaces, right, coming across here. This is just wonderful, right? And so some of these are overflow onto inset channel features, right? And some of them are overflow onto floodplain features. So BDAs are easy to get excited about for sure. But what we have to remember is that these take 2 to 5 times longer to build than a channel spanning PAL, right? And so that's really what you've got to kind of keep your eye on, is whether or not you're going to be able to achieve a similar sort of result with a structure that may take 15 to 45 minutes to build, in some cases even less, versus one that's going to take an hour to 3 hours to build. Okay. So this is an example from a fire. Josh White took this picture. This is an emergency post-fire treatment that was done in order to try and capture this excess runoff from post-fire event and use it as a restoration opportunity instead of this disaster we were afraid of. And a BDA would have fit the bill here. We could have graded a bunch of material behind this instead of it being the bowling alley it was just prior. More connectivity with inset floodplains, et cetera, et cetera. Look at all of this fresh deposition right above the crest of, in this case, a PALS, right? So here's the structure, just drag a bunch of material and a bunch of wood down in, shove a few posts to hold it in place, off you go on to the next one. Every bit as effective at getting that geomorphic response as a BDA would have been, and a lot more efficient. So we use a lot of these. We also use a lot of, just the other flavors of PALs. This is a little anecdote that I like. Robin Wignall from the Forest Service is a different fire in Nevada, the Gants fire. And she built nothing but BDAs. And these are cool, right? So she put these BDAs in, and this was, right after the burn, racing, or actually in the snow, I think they were practically building in. Well, look at where the crest elevation is here, and look at the backwater, right? Bars don't lie. Fresh bars are only as high as the flow got up to. So you can see the sort of stage that the flow got up to, and it's totally structurally forced in the backwater of this BDA. So this is working. But my question to Robin was, hey, you could have built some PALs, you could have built some other things, you could have covered more ground. But I just love these little series of texts from her, where you can just see it on the timestamps. I don't have the timestamps on here, but where she's walking around in the spring, and so she's seeing some of this stuff for the first time, and she's just so excited with the responses that she's seeing, right? Have some gap teeth after the main part of flooding, but everything's functioning to plan. Wow, super excited about this. Worked way better than I would have imagined. New meander and inset floodplain. I mean, it's just, the enthusiasm is really fun to see here. New clean gravel for the Lahontan cutthroat trout. And so I show you this to think about a couple of things. One, yeah, don't be afraid to try some stuff. and be prepared for the sort of process responses. But as you get more experience, do start to think about whether or not you could have done something and gotten a similar response with less effort. Not because you should be lazy, but because you can take that extra effort and you can put it into strength in numbers, more structures covering more miles of stream. But also, there's no consequence here, right? Like, this worked. This was great. So head cuts on return flows can be wonderful things. So this is head cuts usually just get labeled as runaway incision, but that's when it's a head cut in a single thread channel that's the only game in town, and it's marching upstream. So if that head cut's been arrested for whatever reason, that's a different story. Or in this case, when the head cut is really a channel head or the beginning of a channel head that is indicative of floodplain connectivity. Like, this was a goal. Why is this thing flooding at this flow? It shouldn't be flooding. Well, it's flooding because of a big debris jam and some PDAs that were built upstream that are designed to push water out. And so this overflow and then the return flow to the lower elevation channel, you're going to get these head cuts, and you can actually use those specific channel head type head cuts as an indicator of success. So in conclusion, there's no single correct way to do your design. There's a lot of things that could work. However, you do want to keep your eye on what's the big picture goal that you're trying to achieve. And so, here you wanted to anastomose and kind of push towards that recovery potential. So you're going to need some things that split flow. You want to blast banks where you can to make some of that floodplain more accessible. In this particular example, and once you do get flows successfully out onto that floodplain, maybe like we're seeing here, you could have some other handoff structures that do some cool things. So if I was to tell you that there's only one way to do this, that's about as silly as saying, like, there is only one way to cook the burger, or there is only, maybe Ron Swanson or something, but or there's only one way to bake a good chocolate chip cookie. It's something you may say to exaggerate a point. You may have your preferences for how you do it, but it is not the case. There's a lot of different ways, and actually develop a foodie mentality, right? Celebrate the diversity of the way food can be prepared and enjoyed, etc. And that's where I'll leave you. Okay. I do want to point out that if you want another example in another system, that on the Capstone class, this is for actually Jay Wild's Birch Creek, we do have a nice example on there, and I walk you through how to do this same game, but for those of you that are GIS folks, it's basically doing the same thing, but in ArcGIS. One of the nice things about doing it there is you get all of your measurement, and you can have your data, and you can put other attributes in. Off of that same page, these are the horrible steps summarized. This is a good way to put you to sleep. But let's just kind of distill this. It's what we did today. We read our riverscape. We chose some appropriate structure types to put in there and take advantage of opportunities and kick off the process. We located our structures specifically. And then we articulated a design hypothesis of what we expect to happen with a zone of influence polygon, and we did that at the structure scale. And so this is a good exercise to go through when you're learning how to make this stuff work, and you want to see it play out very explicitly. To get your complex zone of influence, then you just take the union of all those little structure zones of influence, and you're off to the races. Another thing that can be really helpful is to play these videos in the field. And this really is the last slide for the presentation here. And what I'll do is go ahead and play this for you. That's where that text came from. And I don't know if the audio.
Okay, we're downstream here at our next site. Steve's showing us here on River Left where we're going to start. We're going to try and build wherever you can fit them in between all those boulders and junk there. Bunch of posts out to about that point there. Set the crest elevation about where that high flow stage was, right in there. And then we're going to be pushing flow up against that edge, hopefully carving out an undercut, a pool, maybe eventually felling those alders in and recruiting those. That's it. Okay, we're
So that little video in 36 seconds covered the intent of the design. Just another way you can document this stuff, right? We've built apps that collect those videos. Crews can watch them if they want, et cetera, et cetera. Once you get your communication down, that's probably a bit overkill, but that sort of level of documentation can be really quick and really helpful in terms of articulating design intent as well. Okay, if you've got next up, what we're going to hear about is from Nick Weber, and it's going to be how you actually operationalize these things and a field app that Nick's produced. Take care.